Ancient Faith Radio presents Speaking the Truth in Love with Father Thomas Hopko. Father Thomas is the Dean Emeritus of St. Vladimir's Orthodox Seminary and the author of numerous books and articles. From his study in Elwood City, Pennsylvania, here is Father Tom.
We're continuing now our reflections about Darwin and Darwinianism and the Darwinian Revolution, the issue of evolution, the issue of the relation of natural science to Christian theology. And this is the second in our series. Today, I would like just to very briefly, superficially, go through the life of Charles Darwin. Just who was this man who created this incredible explosion, this revolution, whose name is in some places blessed and whose work is idolized, and in other places it's cursed, and the man himself even is demonized. We have to go through all these things and to try just today, out of love for our neighbor, to see who the man really was. You know, the two things that have to operate in all of our work as Christians, all of our life, every thought, word, and deed, are truth and love. We have to find out as much as we can how things really are, and then we have to love everyone and everything without condition, without qualification. That's what Christians do. That's what Christians are. That's how God is, we believe. God is always for the truth. God is truth. Christ is the truth. And it's the truth that makes us free, that gives us peace. Troubles us deeply first. It's kind of like the Peanuts cartoon where the little boy is looking there and he says, "What are you reading?" He says, "It's St. John's Gospel." What's it say? It says, "You will know the truth, and the truth will make you free." And then the other fellow looks and says, "Yep, but first it makes you miserable." And what we're going to see today is how miserable Charles Darwin was because of what he was convinced was the truth, what he believed was the truth. So we have to be for the truth, and we believe that every truth is Christian. Every truth is compatible with the gospel of Christ. There can't be contradictions between truth anywhere, any kind of truth, and Christ himself. But there's love, too. When I was a young fellow, I used to have to teach philosophy to the seminary students, collegiate division we had in those days, and I was obliged to have them read through like Karl Marx and Bertrand Russell, and Nietzsche and all that stuff. They say, "Father Tom, why do we have to read this?" I said, "Because our Lord told us to love our enemies, bless those who curse us, to treat them with respect, to hear what they have to say." And then, of course, we read last time from the 1 Peter letter in the Bible, we have to be ready to give an answer for the hope that is in us. And we do it gently. I'm not sure even if we quoted the whole passage last time, but it's worth repeating if we did or if we didn't. But where it says in Peter, "Always be prepared to make a defense to anyone who calls you to account for the hope that is in you," he says, "Yet do it with gentleness and reverence, and keep your conscience clear, so that when you are abused, those who revile your good behavior in Christ may be put to shame." So we not only give an account of our hope, but we do it with gentleness and reverence and a clear conscience. And if we ourselves are abused, that's okay. Let people revile our good behavior, that they may be put to shame. And I think that what we'll see today is that Charles Darwin really followed the truth as he saw it. Maybe he didn't see it totally clearly, but he followed it as he saw it. He tried not to lie, and he always was a gentle man and a reverent man. He was not a pugnacious man. He was not a belligerent man. He was not a fighter. Thomas Huxley was, and others were, but not Charles Darwin. So who is this man? Well, one of the reasons that I got interested in him, in addition to those I've already mentioned, was that this year of 2009 was the 200th anniversary of the birth of Charles Darwin. He was born on exactly the same day and exactly the same year as Abraham Lincoln, two huge figures in human life. And by the way, Lincoln, who quoted God all the time, never went to church, and, well, he went pro forma, but he never was baptized, and he never was committed to any particular church, Abraham Lincoln. Well, Charles Darwin was born in England, and he was in the town of Shrewsbury, and his father was a man named Robert Darwin, who was a very workaholic, aggressive, very successful, very wealthy doctor, physician. He was an obese man, actually. I think he weighed over 300 pounds or something like that. Robert Darwin cared for the sick people. He traveled around. He visited people in their homes. He took care of the sick. He was the son of a man named Erasmus Darwin, who was a notorious fellow, who taught evolutionary theory already before his grandson became famous because of it, Erasmus. He wrote poetry. He was also a kind of a lewd, lascivious, bombastic type of man, and a pretty out there, in-your-face atheist, too. He had no use for the church or the Christian faith or anything. Robert Darwin, his son, the doctor, Charles, his father, he never went to the church at all. And we're going to see how ironic that is. But Janice Brown in her, I think it's Janet or Janice Brown in her biography, she says, as far as she could determine, Charles Darwin's father, Robert, was inside a church building twice in his life. The day that they baptized him and the day that they took him in there for his funeral. He was simply not a church-attending person. He was an atheistic person, pretty clearly. But he was not a belligerent one like his father, Erasmus. And in that sense, probably Charles was much more like his own father rather than his grandfather. But his father did tell Charles once that, if you're going to marry a pious woman, and both Robert Darwin and Charles Darwin married first cousins. They're from the Wedgwood family of the famous people who made plates and pottery in England, very, very wealthy also. But Charles Darwin's wife, Emma, was very pious and a Unitarian, as I mentioned last time, but went to church all the time, believed in God, prayed, said her prayers, definitely believed in everlasting life. But I think functionally her belief in everlasting life was closer to Plato than it was to the Bible. She believed in like souls going to happy places in heaven, and almost like playing harps with angels or something. That was her view of the bliss of everlasting life, simplistically put. But she was a believer, and when Charles was going to marry her, I'm getting ahead of my story here, but he discussed with his father the fact about her religiosity. And the father said, well, just be quiet about it. Don't talk about it. Go about your business. Don't make an issue about it. And let her do what she's going to do, and then you do what you have to do and live in peace. And basically, I think Charles Darwin did take his father's advice on that one. So he was born on February 12th in the year 1809. So that would be 200 years ago this year. And the other date that we're interested in is when he publishes the book, The Origin of Species, on the origin of species according to natural selection. He did that in 1859, which makes this year the 150th anniversary of the publication of The Origin of the Species by Natural Selection. And I really wanted to get these reflections started now. Time is flying by, and I got caught up in so many things lately, and I didn't get started with this as quickly as I wanted to. But I wanted to start this month because this explosive book, revolutionary book, on the origin of species by natural selection actually came out in November 1959. So it was this very month, 150 years ago, that the book, The Origin of Species, appeared, sold out immediately, became a very popular book. Everybody was reading it. And that started, or didn't start, but it was a major, major event in the relationship of natural science in modern life. And natural science, of course, in what we're interested in, its relation to the Christian gospel. So Charles Darwin was born in this very rich family. His father thought that he would never amount to anything. And his father even, there's even a quotation in one of the biographies that I wrote down, it's often quoted, where Charles wasn't doing well in school at all. He didn't like to study. He liked only to go out and shoot guns and kill animals and hunt. He loved that all his life. He said he had no more joy could be found when he remembers killing his first snipe and reloading his gun because his hands were trembling so much. But they lived in this countryside, in huge house, in great opulence. And basically, Charles didn't study very much and did what he wanted. And so his father said to him, this is the quotation, "You care for nothing but shooting, dogs, and rat catching, and you will be a disgrace to yourself and all your family." That's what he told him. You will be a disgrace to yourself and all your family. So Charles' father, Robert, wanted Charles to be a physician, a doctor. And he would take him on his rounds and visit the people. And Charles just couldn't stand this. He couldn't stand the sight of blood. Even later on, he even has trouble plucking off the birds that he would study their skeletons and everything when he was doing his natural studies, and the smell of all that and so on. It really repulsed him. But Charles' father, Robert, thought that he should become a doctor, and he would make him go to doctor school, physician school, medical school. And he even tried to get him to go that way. And so when Charles, became of age, they tried to send him to the medical school in Cambridge, and Charles just could not stand it. He witnessed his first operation, surgery, and the first dissection of a corpse or something, and he just couldn't handle it. He just went away, and he didn't know what to do. And here's where the ironic point comes in. His father said to him, well, if you can't do this, why don't you become a minister in the church, become a priest in the Church of England? That's a great job. You like to go hunting, you like to have birds, you like to collect flowers, because from his youth, Charles was always studying this natural phenomena. Flowers, plants, birds, bumblebees, carbuncles, God knows what. He wasn't studying everything, he just loved it. And that's where his heart was, that's where his treasure was. The Lord Jesus said, where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. Well, Charles Darwin's treasure was in nature. There's no doubt about that. It was just in natural life. Just the physical, animal, botanical world. That's what he adored. That's what kept him going his whole life. So anyway, this Charles, the father thought he could be a minister. Now, we're going to have a special reflection on the state of the Church of England at the time of Charles Darwin and of Christianity generally, and what this poor Charles would have to come up against when he was dealing with Christian faith. But in any case, what we want to see now is that it wasn't very surprising that a parent who never went to church, was a kind of a silent, non-pugnacious, non-belligerent, but certainly confirmed atheist, would actually recommend that his boy, his son, go to Cambridge to the divinity school and become a minister, become a priest of the Church of England. And that shows that people didn't take it seriously at all. They didn't feel it meant anything real at all. You just went through it. It was part of the aristocracy. And anyone who's familiar with the novels of people like Jane Austen and Trollope and all those people, you see what the clergy were like at the time of Charles Darwin in the 19th century. They were like guys who couldn't be successful very much anywhere else, so then they were ordained into the clergy, and that meant that they had a nice big house and they had a garden. Sometimes they had a greenhouse, they had a botanical garden, they had fields, they could go hunting, they could go fishing, they could raise pigeons, they could raise orchids, flowers, and they just had a really nice, comfortable life and so on. So it's amazing, but this Richard Darwin suggested to his son Charles that you do that, that's good for you. It probably shows that he didn't have not much faith in him at all to be able to turn into anything. And I can't help saying over the radio that when I left my home at the age of 17 to go to college, and then I went to the seminary the next year at 18 and finished the college there. But my father, he thought that clergy, this was in the Orthodox Church of Russian tradition in America in the 1950s, he said, what kind of a life is that, where you make smoke and kiss pictures and spend your time with old ladies sprinkling them with holy water? That was his view of the clergy in the Orthodox Church in the 20th century, Well, I think in England it wasn't very far from that. In fact, my father insisted that I go to the university before the seminary, or at least concurrently, because he said he didn't want anyone to think that his son was too dumb to study and too lazy to work. And so if you couldn't go work in the factories or the coal mines, and if you couldn't get out of college so that you could get a better job, well, you became a priest. They married you off to some other priest's daughter, and you went there and you sang songs in Russian and Slavonic, and you made services, and you blessed baskets, and you buried people, and that was the view of life. One of my sisters actually said to me when I left home, "What a waste." Because I was a pretty smart guy in school, as you could probably guess. Not an intellectual or a scholar, but smart enough. But in any case, Charles Darwin was not considered to be very smart. He was not considered to be too much worth anything. His father thought he'd be a disgrace to the family, so at least go become a minister. Enter the church. go through the motions, do the rites, read the Common Prayer Book prayer, and do your natural studies like a whole lots of other ministers were doing. And it's interesting how many of the naturalists in Britain, in England in the 19th century were clergy. A whole bunch of them were clergy because they liked studying those things and they had the means to do so. And they were part of the higher classes of the country. Well, anyway, Charles did go to Cambridge, and while he was there, he really kind of fell in love with geology. And being at the university, he became a follower of a particular teacher in geology. I think his name was Hemsley. I could look it up here quickly. It really doesn't really matter too much what the man's name was. Henslow. It was J.S. Henslow. That's right. It was Henslow. And Henslow was a geology teacher, and oh, did Darwin love him. And his friends even would mimic Darwin walking around with Henslow, imitating the way he walked, carrying on discussions with this man, and he just loved it. But what happened was this, and this is what changed Charles Darwin's life and brought us to where we are today on this very podcast. This Henslow had the possibility and was offered the possibility to go on a ship called the Beagle, that was going to do map studies and discovery studies around the Galapagos Islands and near Latin America and so on. And they wanted a naturalist to be on board the ship, someone who would study the nature, the fauna, the flora, the animal life, fossil life, whatever they could find in these places, and kind of keep a log and be on that ship and go with them. And I believe that Henslow himself was offered the trip, and he couldn't take it. He had just gotten married. It wasn't a good time for him to go, and he thought this is a perfect thing for Charles Darwin to do. So he said to Darwin, let's try to get you to go with Captain Fitzroy on the ship, the big sail ship called the Beagle, HMS Beagle, and go on this kind of round-the-world trip, that Darwin had read about in all many books, and he loved to read about foreign and exotic places and so on. So this Henslow convinced him that he should apply to go. And they were willing to accept him to go and to be the naturalist on this, the HMS Beagle, this ship. Well, his father was totally against it, thought it was a complete and total waste of time, thought it was just ridiculous, and just basically forbade him to go. But then Charles Darwin went to his uncle, his future wife's father, the Wedgwood family there, whom he really adored, and because his father said, if you can get one rational man who has a shred of sense in him to convince me that this is a good idea, well then, okay, you have my blessing, you're my permission to go. And this uncle, I think his name is Josiah Wedgwood, he convinced Richard Darwin to let his son go on this tour, on this boat. So Charles did go, and the journey was 5 years long. For 5 years, he was away from England. He was on this boat with the huge sails and masts, sailing all along the coasts of, South America and the Galapagos Islands and all these places. And he was just fascinated, blown away by what he saw. And all he did was think and look and write and find all kinds of specimens of rocks and plants and fossils and animals and birds and fish and everything that he could possibly do. He had a hard time on this voyage. He wrote about it, actually, the Voyage of the Beagle. You can read about it. It's published. But he had terrible seasickness. Oh, half the time when he was on the boat, he was just throwing up. He had a terribly weak stomach, and that will plague him his entire life long. And he was only so happy when he could get off that boat, and the boat might go somewhere else for a couple of months, and he would stay on land somewhere doing all of his naturalistic studies. But after 5 years, Darwin returned to England. He made it back home. The Beagle came back in 1831. They had left in 1831 and came back in 1836. It was in 1835 that he did the survey of the Galapagos Islands. And then he got back and he had all this data, not only in his head, but in loads of notebooks and sources and boxes. And he was sending back all the stuff from the journey. And here, the point is made very strongly in all the biographies that his father, who didn't want him to go in the first place, bankrolled the whole trip. Whenever Charles needed money, whenever he wanted to ship things, whenever he wanted to pack things, whenever he wanted to do, his father foot the bill. His father was very, very rich, and he was willing to give the money to this son for the sake of this work that he was doing, and basically he supported him his whole life. Charles Darwin never worked a day of his life outside his own home. He never even was a professor anywhere or a scientist in any group or anything. He worked in his house. He had all his equipment there, all his books, all his fossils, all his specimens, everything that he was doing, everything that he was thinking of, everything that he was working on. And he had a big house and home and everything, basically because of his inherited money. He was an aristocratic, rich fellow who could just do what he wanted. And what he wanted was natural science. That's what he wanted. That's what he loved. That's where his treasure was. So when he came back, shortly after he came back, he did not know how to put all this stuff together. He didn't know what to do with it. But he started thinking, what are species anyway? How do they interrelate? It seems like there's different kinds in different places that you don't know how they produce there. It didn't seem to make sense to him that God out of nothing created each one directly. And he gave that theory up very early, that God independently created every possible thing that existed in some type of miraculous way, or he created the species unchanging in some miraculous way, and then the species just reproduced by producing the same type of species. So cows had cows, and birds had birds, and fish had fish, and they were the same kind of fish, and there were different kinds. They were called species. Well, he just began to doubt all that just by studying what he saw. And then seeing what he saw, he began to develop a theory that it seems that species evolve. And evolution was already taught. His grandfather Erasmus taught it. Lamarck taught it. They just didn't know how it worked. There was another book called The Vestiges by a guy named Chambers. He did it anonymously, that simply forthrightly taught evolutionary theory, that different species, different types of beings are produced by earlier beings by some type of change, some type of mutations. They didn't know how or in which way, but they were pretty clear that that is what was going on. And Charles Darwin knew this, of course. And then he was studying the data that he had. Well, as he's looking at this data, one of the books that really influenced him was a book by Thomas Malthus about population, where it says that, the populations produce more species than, more offspring than can possibly exist. So the stronger ones persist and the weaker ones die out. And then the stronger ones reproduce, and then they reproduce and hand on their strength. And then what happens is, over very long periods of time, there are certain changes that take place, metamorphoses or whatever you want to call them, mutations or whatever, that then get passed on genetically. But Charles Darwin didn't know how all that happened. And most of the historians of science will say that we have only, allegedly, but certainly it's a firm conviction of the scientific community by and large, that what happens is it takes place over very, very, very long periods of time, with small incremental changes being passed on, and the changes that make the species stronger or make the offspring stronger, they persist and they continue to grow, and then they change a little bit too, and then strong species grow, and that's how everything came, probably from some very primitive form of life, even perhaps a one-celled thing developed in all these ways in very different directions. Basically, that's what he was beginning to see. And then by reading Malthus, who was writing simply about population, he came to the conclusion that provided quite an insight into the possibility of how this possibly worked. It meant that the stronger survived and the weaker didn't. And then you had these little changes, and in those, whatever changes took place, however they took place, the changes that were for the better survived, and those that were for the worse did not. And basically, in a nutshell, that's what he came to believe. Now, at this time, he got married. He married Emma, Uncle Josiah's daughter, so he married his first cousin, and he even used to worry about that too, because he began to realize, even before genetics was developed, that when human beings marry their close relatives, their offspring are usually weaker, and they have troubles and they have sicknesses and so on. It's not a healthy thing to marry someone close to you in your family. But he did, and they had a couple of children who died. We'll see the death of Annie is a huge thing in his life, one of his children. And by the way, death was all over the place here. Charles Darwin's own mother died, I think, when he was 8 years old. Charles Darwin's father, Richard, his brother, committed suicide. His own mother died when he was a baby. Death was all around at that time, even in the great progressive England of the 19th century. Children and diseases were rampant, diphtheria and all these kind of things that killed off people. But he marries his cousin in 1839. In the same year, he publishes some of his journals of research. And by 1842, he makes a first sketch of a kind of an evolutionary theory based on what we have just been saying, that species come from other species through development over a long period of time with incremental changes, and the stronger ones persist and the weaker ones are extinct. And then when there are geological changes and what we'd say today ecological changes, even sometimes whole species just become extinct. They all die out. Sometimes there's catastrophes that cause them to die out. All this was in Lamarck and others already, so we can't get into that. But that's what he was dealing with. That's what he was dealing with. And so in the year 1844, he began to really be deeply troubled by what he believed that he saw, what he was convinced that he had learned by all these studies. And that's all he did day and night, was study all these things. He later on will write a 6-volume work on barnacles. He will write about 4,000 pages on earthworms. He just studied all these things, did all these kind of experiments, made all these changes. And then he was involved very much with the people who were changing species by selective breeding. That was another idea that he had. He said if botanists and animal husbandry people can actually produce new kinds of animals and new kinds of plants by crossbreeding, why can't that happen by some type of process of natural selection? Why can't it just happen because of ecological changes, or he didn't know too much about that, but genetic mutations or whatever? Why could not that be? That's what he thought. And so in 1844, he wrote a letter to his friend Joseph Hooker, who was his friend all the way through all this. And already in that letter, his new friend, the 26-year-old botanist Joseph Hooker, this is what he wrote. This is quoted in almost all Darwin materials that you would read. This is what he wrote. He said, "I have been now ever since my return," meaning from the 5-year voyage on the Beagle, "engaged in a very presumptuous work. I was so struck with the distribution of the Galapagos organisms." And by the way, there's a movie going on right now, you can get it right now, of some intelligent design people, a scientific group, who went to the Galapagos Islands and to try to disprove the Darwinian theories by studying the animal life and plant life on those islands. I did not see it. I have to confess, I did not see it, but I know it exists. And if you're interested, you might want to try to look that up on the internet. A tour of some, I think they're evangelical Christians of some sort, intelligent design supporters, who just made a trip to Galapagos Islands to take a look over there for themselves, so to speak. But anyway, here, way back in 1844, Charles Darwin writes, "I was so struck with the distribution of the Galapagos organisms and with the character of the fossil American mammifers that I determined to collect blindly every sort of fact which could bear in any way on what species are." And by the way, what we're going to see also, this is mentioned in Ben Stein's movie, there's still a huge debate even of what species are. When is a species a new species? And when is it not simply another variety of something within the same species? When do you have an absolutely new kind of a bird, for example, or a new kind of a dog, and not simply a variant of a kind that you have already have? Why do you call it a different species? And there's a fellow interviewed by Ben Stein who says, we don't even know what species are. Even yet, we don't know. And in fact, Darwin himself, in his notebooks, he says, we're trying to define the indefinable. He said, I don't think we'll ever be able to find the answer to that question. But what he was convinced of is that new species really do emerge. In other words, you have some species that once could be considered, fish, and later can then be considered birds, or once can be considered some type of animal, and then later can be considered to be a human being. So this is what he was dealing with. He says, I was determined to collect all these facts blindly and which in any way bear on what our species. At last gleams of hope have come, and I am almost convinced, quite contrary to the opinion I started with, that species are not, and then he writes in parentheses, it is like confessing a murder, immutable. So he says that species are not immutable, and then he puts in parentheses, it's like confessing a murder. He said, I think I have found out, here's the presumption, the simple way by which species become exquisitely adapted to various ends. You will now groan and think to yourself, on what a man I have been wasting my time in writing to. And he says, I myself would have thought so 5 years ago. So it's interesting that he feels like he's committing a murder by what he finds. But he keeps on studying, he keeps refining the theory, he keeps putting it together, and he comes up with a theory that changes in the environment, competition between and within and among species, variation naturally occurring within species as it was driven by the excessive procreation over the numbers the environment could possibly support. So this is what he's coming up with, but it's making him sick. It's making him physically sick. He said, for example, that in an 8-year period before he actually published On the Origin of Species, he had 2 whole years, if he added up all the weeks and months, in which he was simply bedridden. He was just plain sick. His stomach, he would throw up about every hour. He would go to take some kind of water cures all over the place. This study of his was not something that made him joyful and peaceful and happy. He realized himself what he thought he was seeing and what the consequences of it was, particularly for those who simply believed in what most people call a literal reading of the Bible. Now, I'm going to critique that immensely when I get a chance. What is really a literal or literary reading of the Bible? How should the Bible be read? But in those days, at that time, and perhaps even today in many places, there are people who think that the Bible teaches geology, the Bible teaches biology, the Bible teaches all these things, and in Genesis you have a record of how it all happened, and God created the world in 6 24-hour periods, maybe longer, maybe shorter, whatever, but and that the whole thing is not more than 10,000 years old, 6 to 10,000. And, people believe that, and at that time that was pretty much the common knowledge. And everybody really, you had natural theology very popular at that time. A man named Paley had a book that was widely read. He believed in certain forms of evolution, Paley did, but he said it's designed by a creator. There's an intelligent cause to all of this. And there was a period where people even thought that the nature was as much a revelation of God as the Bible was. You can study and see the hands of God working in nature. And that was an old Platonistic early Christian idea. The world as a book of God's self-revelation. Certainly the Orthodox tradition holds that, and we hold that to this very day. I believe we do. We'll get to that later. But in any case, Charles Darwin was sick over all of this, and he kind of even hid it. He didn't make it known. He didn't discuss it much with anybody except other very close friends, scientists. He didn't discuss it with his wife practically at all, although she was wondering what he was doing day and night. Studying. She knew that he was going through something. He didn't share the details of it. On the PBS film called Darwin's Darkest Hour, there's a film about the darkest hour of Darwin's life when he was struggling over whether or not to publish this, during which time his children were deathly sick, and then his favorite little girl, Emma, died. Emma dies away from home at some water cure place. She died in 1851. Excuse me, I keep calling her Emma. Emma is his wife, Annie. His beloved daughter, Annie, died in 1851. He didn't even go to the funeral. He couldn't bring himself to go even look at her grave. He never saw her grave in his entire life. But after the funeral of Annie, he never went to church again with his family. He used to go and sit there, but now he didn't even do that. He would walk with them to church and then go back home. And we're going to see later on what the issue of death, what place death holds in this whole story, this whole saga. Because I'm absolutely convinced in my own mind that Thomas Huxley and Charles Darwin, they could not handle the church because they could not believe what the church was teaching them about death and about resurrection and about souls going to heaven and about going to hell and all that kind of stuff. They just couldn't stomach it, they couldn't. And it didn't comfort them. They weren't able to be comforted by that. They knew too much about the scientific processes and death. We're going to have to deal with that very head-on at some later moment, the issue of death in the theory of natural selection and the place of death in the Christian view. Because we're all facing death. We all are. And we believe the world was saved by the death of God in human flesh. That should say something about our relation to the theory of evolution. I don't think anybody's ever even thought of it too much. I've never seen much about it, frankly. But in any case, we'll get to that. But his daughter dies. He's struggling over what he sees. He doesn't want to prematurely publish it because he wants to have all the facts and all the ducks lined up and everything set so that he could make his theory as unassailable as he possibly could make it. And while he's struggling over all of this and throwing up every day and working on his abstract, which is already something like 500 pages long, he doesn't know what to do. But then he discovers he receives a letter in the mail from a man named Wallace. And this man named Wallace was also a naturalist, and he was also studying the very same things that Darwin was. And this man named Wallace writes to Darwin in 1857. Let me get Wallace's full name here. I think it was William Wallace. And this younger fellow of Darwin, about 10 or 15 years younger, he writes to him to share with him his theory. And lo and behold, the theory is almost exactly what Darwin himself was coming to believe and to be convinced of. And it really shocked Darwin. It really shocked Darwin because he thought, I've done all this work. I've lived all my life. I've studied all these things. I've taken all my time. I've, thrown up and been sick and did all these things. And then here this fellow Wallace writes me this letter, and he tells me that he's studying almost exactly the same thing that I myself have come to. And that took place in 1858. 1858. Now, little Annie had died in 1851. In those years, he kept working, and he did this 6-volume work on barnacles and how they changed. And then on June 18th in 1858, he gets this letter from Wallace. And Wallace was influenced by the same Lyell that had influenced Charles Darwin. And so Charles Darwin just doesn't know what to do. And this is what was shown on TV when it said that was Darwin's darkest moments. Those years when he didn't know what to do. His daughter, his beloved daughter Annie, dies. The naturalist, I got his name now, Alfred Russel Wallace, independently arrives at a very similar theory. Sends it to Darwin. Darwin doesn't know what to do. He's studying this all his life, and now it's going to come out. And so he has the decision, what is he going to do? And what he does is he writes to Wallace, and they decide together. It's an amazing thing that they could be so gentlemanly. It'd be like 2 PhD candidates fighting over who's going to publish their theory first. In fact, recently I borrowed a work from a person, by the way, recently on a particular subject, and I kept it kind of long. And then I got an email from this person says, what are you going to do? Write your own book about it and beat me to it? It's sort of similar to Wallace and Darwin. I had to write back to the person and say, no, I'm not going to publish anything. I don't even know anything about it. I'm sorry, I'll get your PhD dissertation back to you pretty quick, and I pray to God that you'll publish it very soon. But the poor person thought that I was, ripping off the work by myself. Well, Wallace and Darwin, they were gentlemanly, and they said, let's do it together. So at one of the scientific meetings in London at the time, where all the main scientists were together, the two of them gave a paper together about their theory. And what is really interesting is that the scientists almost didn't even pay attention to it. They didn't even take it seriously. They didn't see how revolutionary it was. It was at the Linnaean Society in 1858. They just didn't see what it was. But then when Darwin then went ahead and published his abstract, and it was only considered an abstract, although it's 500 pages long. In the English version that I have, it's actually 459 pages long. He called that an abstract. He did write later volumes more with more details and more evidence and so on, trying to defend his theory. But it came out as I said, in 1859 in November. It saw the light of day. People snapped it up. They read it and so on. And I tried to read it. It's tough to read. But in any case, I'd just like to read you a little bit of the end of the origin of species by natural selection, just so you would have a little taste here of how he wrote. He said, right on the next to last page, he said, in the distant future, I see open fields for far more important researches. Psychology will be based on a new foundation, that of the necessary acquirement of each mental power and capacity by gradation. Light will be thrown on the origin of man and his history. In the book on the origin of species, he never writes about man. He publishes his book on man only about 8 years later, called The Descent of Man. But then he continues, authors of the highest eminence seem to be fully satisfied with the view that each species has been independently created. To my mind, it accords better with what we know of the laws impressed on matter, and he says this, by the Creator. So he thought there was a creator. That's very important. Even though he didn't go to church, lost his faith over the death of his daughter, couldn't stand what they were teaching in church, had a great trouble with hell and death and heaven and all that kind of stuff. Nevertheless, he says, by the Creator, that the production and extinction of the past and present inhabitants of the world should have been due to secondary causes, like those determining the birth and death of the individual. So he didn't have any problem with the Creator using secondary causes, like happens even with human beings who die and leave their children and so on, and are born from other individuals. He said, quoting again, when I view all beings not as special creations, he meant directly by the hand of God, but as the lineal descendants of some few beings which lived long before the first bed of the Silurian system was deposited, they seem to me to be ennobled. So he claimed that it was ennobling to human to think that they were the result of such a long, tedious process of development. He didn't think that they were degraded. He thought that they were ennobled. That's what he claimed. He said, judging from the past, we may safely infer that not one living species will transmit its unaltered likeness to a distant futurity. Of the species now living, very few will transmit progeny of any kind to a far distant futurity, for the manner in which all organic beings are grouped shows that the greater number of species of each genus and all the genus species of many genera have left no descendants and have become utterly extinct. So he said, not everything will go on forever, And as a matter of fact, scientists tell us now that 99% of beings that once existed on the planet Earth no longer exist. They're already extinct. And extinction is going on all the time. And then you have the question that's got to come up, what about human extinction? Will that also happen? And I think scientifically, we would believe it would happen. There will be an end of the world. Humanly speaking, the world is like Father Schmemann used to say, a whirling cemetery full of dead people's bones. Unless there is a God and God intervenes and enters into the process himself and becomes human and destroys death and raises the dead, as we Christians believe, and restores the whole of creation, including all the plants and animals, as we Christians also believe. but I'm getting ahead of our story here. So anyway, I want to read the last line of this revolutionary book. The last line goes like this: "There is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers, having been originally breathed into a few forms, or into even maybe one form, and that while this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed laws of gravity," he was still in the Newtonian understanding of gravity, not yet the Einsteinian one, "from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are still being evolved." So that's not total atheism, and that's not atheism of a bad, evil man. That's just a view of a scientist who tries to understand what he's dealing with. And to Darwin's credit, I think we can say he never thought too much about the meaning of it all. I don't think he had a metaphysical bone in his body. He was a naturalist, not a supernaturalist. He was not a philosopher. He was a scientist. But he was trying to say what he saw and not to lie about it. Well, after that publication of that book, his life went on. He did many more studies. He published about plants. He published about earthworms. He wrote a book about plants and animals. He wrote a book about human beings where he came right out and said that he thought the human beings had also evolved. So in 1868, that would be 9 years after the origin, he published The Variation of Animals and Plants. And then he wrote a book, The Expression of the Emotions, where he compares animal emotions to human emotions. Then he writes about insectivorous plants, in other words, plants that eat insects. Then he writes about the effects of cross and self-fertilization. He writes about the different forms of flowers. He writes about the power of movement in plants. And he writes about the formation of the vegetable mold. And I should have mentioned that after the book on the variation of animals and plants, specifically mentioned again in 1871, he has the book on the descent of man. Then he finally dies in 1882, and he's sick all that time. He's so sick. That's why you see him in old age with a big long beard, because it was just too painful for him to shave his face. But he continued working and working and working to the end, and he never fought much. He didn't fight at all, practically. He let other people fight his battles, people like Thomas Huxley and Hooker and his friends, Huxley. But he was a kind of a quiet, introverted, scientific man who agonized over what he saw but could not lie. He felt that he had to tell the truth about what he saw. And he would admit all the gaps. He would admit all the hard questions. He would not omit them, he would admit them. He'd say, I still don't understand this. I still don't see this. I still don't see how that could be. But nevertheless, this is what I do see. And this is what he did. And when he finally died, they buried him in Westminster Abbey, right next to Newton, as one of the greatest scientists of his time. And I don't think anybody who has a shred of kindness and truth in them, honesty, can say that this was not a great man, a man who suffered, a man who did his job, but a man who was not very much helped, in my opinion, at all, by the theologians and philosophers and church people of his time. And he wasn't even interested. Maybe he wasn't even capable of a kind of integration of what he saw naturally with what would be an understanding of it, a meaning of it, a purpose of it. Because he even said that, naturally speaking, you can't see a purpose of it. He said when people tried to use his theory, like Herbert Spencer, to show that man was progressing better and better, and of course the white Englishman was better than the black African and everybody else in many people's theories, and so you had a kind of social Darwinism. He didn't get into all that. He said, in my theory, I just see what I see, and it seems to me that man is one of the products on one of the branches, and don't even know what the common root is between man on one side and perhaps chimpanzees or somebody on the other side. By the way, according to Darwin, man didn't come from apes. Apes were on the other side of a tree. Man came from a different way. But there's always this problem of, when is a man a man? When is there self-consciousness? When is there understanding of self-consciousness? Like Dobzhansky will say in the next century, when is there an awareness of freedom, of transcendence, of intelligence, of morality, of death, consciousness of death? Well, man is the only animal who has that particular consciousness. To quote Aristotle, he's the only rational animal. And to quote Heidegger, he's the only animal who has consciousness of his own death. That distinguishes him from everybody else. And he's got to deal with death, and he's got to deal with the agony of it. Well, Darwin dealt with all that in the agony of his own soul over the own deaths of his own child and his own lifetime. But he never philosophized about it. He never made a public statement about it. He certainly never came out as a missionizing atheist, let's say like Richard Dawkins, who considers himself one of Charles Darwin's main disciples in our time. And of course, the theory was attacked. It was modified. It's causing controversy to this day, even in the scientific world, not just in the world of Christian faith or religion, to use that horrible word, generally. You know, it's still with us, all these problems. And Darwin suffered with them as a sickly man, a sensitive man, a gentle man, an honest man, but a man really who indeed never practiced any faith in that sense. But he would speak about the Creator. He would speak saying, thank God. He would use those expressions. And I think that sometimes I feel even to get into all of that was just too painful for him. He just had to live with his own sorrow about the tragedies of life and live with what he saw, feeling like a man who had committed murder, but nevertheless feeling that he did his duty. He did not lie about what he believed he saw. And maybe that's why Metropolitan Trifon respects him. Who knows? I respect him. I pray for him. But we've got to see what happened with all of that. And we got to go on and see what kind of issues does that all raise for us today, like interpreting the Bible, like the relation of God and creation, like the relation of nature and supernature, you know, like the meaning of death, like the place of the crucifixion of Christ in human flesh. How does that all fit into all of this? And is it true or is it not true? Now, it's a theory, but is it just a theory? Or is it a theory that's really very convincing and very plausible when you look at the evidence? You know, and the evidence, of course, is the vestiges of former kinds of reality in the human body itself, the fossil record, especially in more modern time where a lot of gaps have been filled, the issue of the embryology and the genetics and the genetic code, all of these things, the understanding of radiation in time and long periods of time and how that works. So much more has been discovered since Darwin. Only God knows how much more is known. But the question for us today is, we who believe in the gospel of Christ, who believe that Christ is the life and the truth, how do we relate to all of this? Because we're forced to do so and have been compelled to do so in large measure by the work of this man, Charles Darwin. For Ancient Faith Radio, this is Father Thomas Hopko.
And that was Speaking the Truth in Love with Father Thomas Hopko. Father Tom is Dean Emeritus at St. Vladimir's Theological Seminary. This is a listener-supported production of Ancient Faith Radio.